Bark was exported from Portland in large quantities in the early days, with a number of bark crushing mills and exporters involved. A mill on the site of the present-day Caltex service station in Percy Street was the scene of a dreadful accident in 1874, when the Burns brothers had their arms torn off in a bark crushing machine similar to this.
I was pretty young. I don't think I was going to school when I went with Dad one day to strip bark at a friend's place. Oh, it was a long day. And they stripped there, and then they stripped at home, and there was quite a few wattle trees going around about the house and the sheds and down the paddock. And I remember one big tree about 300 or 400 yards from the house. I think they took a day to strip it. It had a big barrel on it, and people used to come stripping bark. These chaps two fellas come from Hotspur, and they stripped around about home quite a bit of bark, and there was interest, but I used to try and get under and watch and think, "Get away, Jack, if I drop this tomahawk on you, you'll be killed." And they had to tell me every time I went to the place. And it was dangerous too, because they stripped from the bottom up, and they were climbing around on green limbs to get the last of the bark. The big stuff at the bottom they'd chop off around about 4 foot length, I suppose, and lay it down on the bark rope. First they had rope they call bark rope. They put a loop in the end, cut off about 6 or 8 foot, and lay it down on the ground, and so forth. 2 pegs in the end. They laid the big bark down on top of it, and they put the small bark down on top of that, and they'd pull it up and give it a kick and tighten as tight as they could, because when it shrunk it was fairly loose, but it always stayed together. And they would lay it across a couple of beams so it would dry. Prior to around about the 1900s, so it was the principal income of a lot of people up home. They had blocks they just let go for wattle bark. And I remember Dad saying his grandparents bought a paddock and a lot of wattle in it, and they were a bit concerned how they were going to pay for it. But he and she and the 2 young boys got to it, and they stripped enough bark out of it to pay for it. The little fellas put socks over their hands because it's very hard on your hands.
So did they climb the trees or use ladders?
No, they climbed the trees. If they had a tree 6 or 8 inches through, they'd take the bottom bark off, the butt bark, and then they'd just chop it down and strip it, because they were working in about waist height. It was easy, and they were the sort of spars then they took home for firewood. But yes, big trees they climbed up in. Yeah, the Nelson wattle was never big like the wattle up around Winnip and Drick. It was spindly stuff, and don't think there's nothing worth falling. They used to strip it off. It was only about perhaps arm thick at the most that I remember of it. But it used to be grow a lot thicker in a lot of pieces. They call that Nelson wattle. I think the stuff up home, it's a black wattle, I think it was. Sometimes it wouldn't strip though. They'd go to strip it and the bark wouldn't run, and they'd wait for a shower of rain or something like that, or wait a month or so, and then it would run.
So was there a time of the year that was better than others?
Yes, apparently. I think it was in the springtime or early summer perhaps. I'm not too sure, but yes, there was times when it wouldn't run. They couldn't get it off. Well, at my earliest time they would, perhaps they went in the horse and cart up to the station and went right by train. But in the early days when wattle bark was pretty prevalent, it went full load on the bullock wagons to Portland. Dad's father used to cart. His brother did. His brother had a team, and I remember Uncle Glenn telling me, he said his brother had been driving about a year, and the front wheel fell through a rabbit burrow on the road and got bogged. He couldn't get the bullocks to pull it out. So he walked home and got his father, and father came over and turned the bullocks off so all the pressure was on the bogged wheel, and he gave them all a bit of a jab, and then up and down the row he went yelling and all cracking the whip, and they pulled it out. They got to get them all pulling together. There was agents in Portland, just forgetting now, I'll think about it in a minute, and in later years sub-agents in Dartmoor, and they had a bit of a mill there where they used to chop it up, put in bran bags, and then most of it went to Michaelis Hallerstein in Melbourne. They would leather treaters. Yes, there were some paddocks that were, they called it the Wattle block, things like that. There were some big trees around about, and they also stripped on the road. There's wattle trees growing on the road, and they get licence from the council and strip on the road. I remember an old chappie stripping the big trees just down below home.
So they weren't concerned about losing the trees?
No, not at all those days. Everybody was only too pleased to get rid of a tree those days. Yeah. Well, they're short livers anyway. They might live, big trees perhaps might live till they're 25 or 30, but that'd be maximum, I should imagine. Yeah. Get a fire through them, they're pretty vulnerable to a fire. They didn't last long after that. But then they came up by the 1,000 after a fire had been through. The wattle seed would crack in the smoke and the flames, and they come up very thick after that.
Stripping wattle bark was an industry that survived into the 1960s, though in a much smaller way than before.
It often intrigues me how the Aborigines kept the land clear with their burning. There must have been often enough that those seedlings would be burnt.
I don't know how many wattles were around about in those days. They must have been there. There was a lot of clear ground. The red ground had the wattles on it mostly. The sandy ground had stringy bark and messmate and all old gum. But of course, they did burn pretty regularly, I think, because it made a green shoot, and that's where the kangaroos came. They get an easy feed. They did that, of course, when they had sheep out here in the run in Kabobony. They used to burn the heaths regularly. They wouldn't burn every year, but they'd burn a heath this year, and then next year they'd burn one just up a bit further. The fires never got away because they was run out to last year's burn.
Must have been what the Aborigines were doing.
Yes, I don't know how often they do it. I've never seen an account of their burning, but I just often just hear they did burn and made tucker for their food. I don't know how often they burnt, but it wasn't easy to get the country burnt those days because there wasn't the introduced pasture, it was all native stuff. And Dad said the kangaroo grass wouldn't burn until you got a real hot north wind day in March, then you'd get it burnt. So, but of course, when you got into the rough stuff, fern and stuff like that, that'd burn any time.
Was there any bad bushfires when you were a kid? What about the 1939 fire? Do you remember that?
Yes, they were at Drumbalk. And yes, we had 2 fires at home and our paddocks coming straight for the house. I was only about 5 or 6, I suppose. No, I was going to school. I might have been 7 or 8. It was a hot day and we used to go down to the creek below home. It was cool under the bridge. And we were down there for the afternoon, and my sister and I, and we came up with a lot of smoke, and I thought, what's going on? And anyhow, there was a fire come out from about south of Mumbana. Dad was away, he used to work on the road, and he saw the fire start. He had a pretty good memory of direction, and he thought, yes, I know where that started, and it would take about 2 miles an hour, he said it would travel, and he said it'll be home about 4 o'clock, and it was. Yeah, but he got home by that time. He walked home, I think, from somewhere where he was working, and they stopped it at the Dick Road. And by that time, they said, in those days, they said the fire didn't travel very well after 4 o'clock. The dampness used to settle. Jack Doyle, you mentioned Jack Doyle. I remember him. He had a hut out on the Jackass somewhere out there. I was never out there, but he used to look after the sheep and burn for the company that Dad's brothers were in. He had a brother, brother-in-law and 2 uncles. They were in company out there and they run sheep. And then Jack used to burn the bushes, burn the heaths and that. They wait for a hot day and they get it going on the hottest of days. They'd burn. You know, I remember as a kid saying the coast needs burning every 3rd year. It was just native pasture, rough pasture. So they would just set a light to it on a day, say a windy day in the end of March or something like that, and just let it burn. They might go along, if it got near the fence, they'd put it out. There wasn't very much what they call flammable material in it. It was just short grass and fern. But they nearly all burnt like that. And as a kid I remember, I suppose the wind swung around to the south and pieces of burnt fern had landed at Winnip. That was 15 mile. Quite big pieces of burnt fern would go up and get caught and away she'd go. At land, but I never burnt once, only once. Of course, during the war, there was no labour for anything. It was a full-time job keeping the rabbits down, and it was only burnt the once. But I remember another time they burnt it, and we took sheep down there. It was green from the distance. It looked like crop. It used to freshen up the butts and that sort of thing.
Would that be kangaroo grass or something else?
No, there wasn't any kangaroo grass there that I can remember. It was just native pastures, whatever was there. They never ever sowed anything down or supered it.
And it was always bare, always open country, wasn't it?
Yes, they never ever done any work as far as clearing it was concerned. Yes, my grandmother told me that the country between Drick and Bridgewater, Portland and the coast was grassy forest. She said there was no ferns in it and they used to run cattle in it. And she said the ferns come up overnight when the rabbits arrived. People thought that they must have carried the fern spores on their feet or something like that. It became pretty grassy, pretty ferny after that. But the paddock was a large area. It was owned by a man, Kane, as absentee landlord. He lived in England and he had manager on, and they used to run cattle in it. And well, there must have been good grass, so the cattle wouldn't have lived in it in my time, that's for sure. The only hope you had was to burn the heaths, like they did. The bullockers used to burn the heaths and let the bullocks go on it while they're travelling, but the rest of the forest had no feed in it, unless it was burnt, and then they used to put sheep on that.